Navy SEAL reveals how Maduro could destroy the U.S. Navy. American warships have been moved close to Venezuela, accompanied by nuclear submarines and thousands of troops. Officially, it's supposed to be an anti-narcotics operation, but the recent incident with the sunk boat, which left 11 dead and was shown on video by Donald Trump himself, raises doubts. Was it just drug interdiction, or a sign that he wants to finish Maduro off? On one side, the U.S. is showing off its military muscle in a historically strategic region. On the other, Nicolas Maduro responds with no fear. The clash between Venezuela and the United States involves the whole world, including China and Russia. It's tied to massive amounts of money. That's why, in this episode, I invited Chris Turner, a Navy SEAL with direct experience in conflict zones, who will help us understand how Maduro wants to and maybe can destroy American naval power. Chris, let's get straight to what's happening right now. What we've got are hard facts that can't be ignored anymore. The Trump administration ordered the deployment of 8 American warships to the Caribbean waters, right off Venezuela, according to info confirmed by the Washington Post and other reliable sources. This is one of the biggest displays of U.S. naval power in the region in decades. We're talking destroyers, a nuclear-powered submarine, amphibious landing ships, and over 4,500 Marines. Chris, from your military experience, what does this kind of movement really mean?
Look, when you see a naval force of this size being positioned, it's not a coincidence. I took part in operations where we used similar setups, and I can tell you one thing, this goes way beyond anti-narcotics patrols. What we're seeing is what we call power projection, a clear show of military capability and political intent. When the U.S. Navy moves 8 ships all at once to one specific region, that has a name. It's a theater operation.
And the timing of this operation is interesting, right? According to reports from Reuters and Al Jazeera, these ships started moving right after the new Trump administration took over and cranked up the rhetoric against Maduro's government. Does that suggest a real strategic shift in American foreign policy toward Latin America?
No doubt about it. The difference here is that we're no longer just talking about economic sanctions or diplomatic pressure. What we're seeing is an escalation into what military strategists call coercive diplomacy, using military presence as a bargaining tool. It's important to understand that an operation of this size doesn't just happen overnight. This was planned, calculated, and signed off on at the highest levels of the Pentagon.
Now, about the specific makeup of this fleet, which, according to Defense Department sources, includes 3 destroyers, 2 amphibious landing ships, combat helicopters, and electronic surveillance systems. Is that really necessary to fight drug trafficking? Or are we seeing prep for something much bigger?
That's the key question. To go after drug smugglers' boats, you don't need amphibious ships or thousands of Marines. Those units are built specifically for landing operations and territorial control. When you see that mix, naval power, amphibious capability, and air support, you're automatically looking at a force capable of everything from naval blockades to coastal occupation missions.
And the international reaction? Because one thing is fighting cartels, but another thing entirely is positioning a combat fleet in international waters right next to a sovereign country. How do you see the world reacting so far?
The reaction has been pretty divided, as expected. The U.S.'s traditional allies in the region, like Colombia, for example, have publicly backed the operation, framing it as a fight against drug trafficking. But when you look at powers like China and Russia, who have major economic interests in Venezuela, the take is completely different. They see this as a military provocation dressed up as an anti-drug mission. It's the classic situation where the same move gets read in totally opposite ways depending on who's looking.
Chris, on the other side of this equation, we've got Nicolas Maduro, who reacted pretty aggressively to this American move in a press conference on September 1st. According to Al Jazeera, Maduro spoke about a nation in arms and announced the mobilization of millions of Venezuelan militiamen. He also said Venezuela was being threatened by 8 warships and 1,200 missiles, calling it the biggest threat to Venezuela in 100 years. Is that a proportional response? Or are we just seeing political theater?
It's a mix of both, and that's typical in high-stakes geopolitical situations. On the one hand, Maduro is genuinely worried about U.S. military pressure any leader would be. On the other hand, he's using this external crisis to tighten his grip at home. When you call up militias and start talking about a second independence, you're tapping into a deep nationalist sentiment that exists in Venezuela and all across Latin America when it comes to the history of U.S. interventions.
And what about this mobilization of militiamen that Maduro announced? According to Venezuelan sources reported by CNN, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of civilians being trained to act as an auxiliary force. Does that have any real military impact? Or is it more symbolic?
It does have an impact, but not in the way most people think. We're not talking about a force capable of taking on the US military in conventional combat. That'd be impossible. But what this mobilization creates is something way trickier to deal with: dispersed resistance and local terrain knowledge. If you've got thousands of armed and trained people spread out across the territory, it makes any military operation way more complex and way more politically costly.
Maduro has also been using a very visual strategy, constantly appearing in uniform, visiting military units, going live with soldiers. According to images released by Reuters, we see him constantly in military settings. Is that effective for keeping the regime internally cohesive?
Absolutely. That's what we call leadership by presence, meaning you show you're in the same trench as your subordinates. Psychologically, that works really well. When soldiers and civilians see their leader wearing the same uniform, sharing the same apparent risks, that builds a sense of solidarity that can be decisive in a crisis. Don't underestimate the power of military symbolism in cultures with a strong anti-imperialist tradition.
But there are risks in this strategy of ramping up the rhetoric. Right, when you whip up the population and the armed forces that much, sometimes you can lose control of the situation.
That's exactly the most dangerous part of this whole thing. Heated rhetoric is like fire, really easy to spark, really hard to control. When you've got thousands of people armed, trained, and emotionally charged, any small incident can blow up into something much bigger. A misunderstanding, an accidental clash, an unintentional provocation, anything can be the spark that turns tension into a real fight.
Now, let's talk about the incident that really took these tensions to another level. On September 2nd, President Trump publicly announced that U.S. forces carried out a lethal strike against a vessel in the Caribbean that, according to him, was carrying drugs and tied to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. The attack left 11 dead, and Trump even posted footage of the operation on his social media. Chris, let's separate facts from rhetoric here. What do we know for sure about this operation?
The confirmed facts are that U.S. forces attacked and destroyed a vessel in the Caribbean Sea, killing 11 people. Trump said the vessel was loaded with drugs and operated by Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan criminal gang. What we don't know are the specific operational details: what type of force was used, whether there was an attempt to surrender, what exactly the cargo was. That kind of info is usually classified in operations like this.
And about releasing the footage? Is it common for U.S. presidents to put out operational military material like that?
Not common at all. Traditionally, military operations are communicated through official Defense Department channels with carefully filtered information. Direct release by the president on social media is a much more political move than a military one. That shows the goal wasn't just eliminating a threat but also sending a public message, both to a domestic audience and internationally.
From the Venezuelan side, Maduro questioned the truth of the American claims, suggesting it was a setup to justify military aggression. How do you analyze these conflicting narratives?
In situations like this, there's always a narrative battle. The Venezuelan government has an interest in discrediting the American version to maintain internal and international legitimacy. The U.S. has an interest in justifying its actions within international law. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It's likely there really were drugs involved, but it's also likely the operation had political goals beyond fighting drug trafficking.
Does this operation mark a shift in the U.S.'s engagement pattern in the region?
Yeah, it's a big shift. We're seeing a move from economic sanctions to direct military action, even if it's still framed as crime fighting. Military analysts call this gradual escalation. Each action is technically justifiable on its own, but together they form a pattern of increasing pressure that can lead to bigger confrontations.
And the broader implications? Are we seeing the start of a new U.S. military doctrine for Latin America?
Could be. What we're seeing looks a lot like the US playbook in the Middle East in the 2000s. Start with specific operations against terrorist or criminal threats, then gradually expand the scope. The difference here is we're talking about the US's geopolitical backyard, where there's way less room for error and the consequences of escalation could be devastating for the whole region.
To wrap this segment, Chris, in your professional assessment, are we looking at a legitimate anti-narcotics operation that got politicized? Or are we seeing the first moves of a broader military strategy?
Based on the patterns I see in my operational experience, I'd say it's both at the same time. There are real elements of fighting organized crime. Tren de Aragua is definitely a serious regional threat. But the size of the military response, the political timing, and the way it was communicated all suggest goals that go way beyond fighting drug trafficking. What we're seeing is a show of force that serves multiple purposes: fighting crime, pressuring Maduro, and sending a message to the whole region about the new American stance. That makes the situation extremely delicate, because each side has incentives to escalate their responses, and when you've got military forces positioned so close to each other, with political tensions running high, the risk of misunderstandings that spiral into real confrontations goes up exponentially.
Chris, when we look at the Caribbean today, especially after these events in September, it's easy to just think about beaches and tourism, but behind that tropical facade, there's a massive geopolitical chessboard in play. What's really at stake in this growing dispute between the US and Venezuela?
Man, you nailed it. I just followed the news these past few days about this US strike on a Venezuelan boat in the Caribbean. Trump even said it publicly: "We took it down." That shows this isn't a joke. The Caribbean, especially the Venezuelan coast, has become one of the most strategic trade and energy routes in the world. Venezuela has some of the biggest oil reserves on the planet. We're talking over 300 billion barrels, plus natural gas, gold, diamonds, and coltan, that mineral that's essential for tech.
And all that sits literally just a few miles from US bases in the Caribbean. Right?
Exactly. It's like having a rich neighbor right next door, except that neighbor's not exactly your friend. Whoever controls that area doesn't just control a pretty map, they control energy power, vital trade routes, and most importantly, influence over all of South America. The US has bases in Puerto Rico, in Colombia, and now they've sent 8 warships to the southern Caribbean. That's no coincidence.
And that helps explain why it's not just the Americans interested there. China's been investing big in the region, right? Seems like the Caribbean turned into a sort of silent battleground between major powers.
No doubt about it. China's not dumb. They've been funding heavy infrastructure in Venezuela: refineries, ports, even projects that are officially civilian but could have dual use, if you know what I mean. And it doesn't stop there. Russia's also in the game. They've sold nearly $10 billion in weapons to Venezuela, including S-300 air defense systems, which are pretty advanced.
So when we see these military exercises Venezuela recently did with China, Russia, and Iran, that's not just muscle flexing. It's a direct message to the Americans.
Clear as day. Those international war games in August, in Barquisimeto, were basically a show of force in the US's backyard. It's like saying, look, you're not alone in this region. And the Americans got the message. That's why now we've got destroyers, submarines, and a Marine Expeditionary Unit doing realistic drills right there in the Caribbean.
From a logistical and strategic point of view, Chris, does controlling the Caribbean actually give significant operational edge?
It's like having a launch pad in your opponent's backyard. The US, for example, uses the Caribbean as the main corridor for moving troops and equipment between the Pacific and Atlantic. A huge chunk of US trade with South America goes through there. If Venezuela shuts down that space or allows permanent military presence from countries like China or Russia, the whole regional balance shifts. Suddenly, the US would have to think twice before making any military move in the region.
And this recent US naval deployment, you think the message isn't just for Caracas, but also for Beijing, Moscow, maybe even Brasilia?
Absolutely. It's a blunt but classy way of saying, we're here, and we still run this region. At the same time, it's an indirect pressure move on Latin American countries, Almost like saying, pick a side. China already publicly slammed this US military buildup, calling it foreign interference. That sounds polite in diplomatic talk, but in real practice, it's heavy stuff.
Chris, now let's look at the numbers coldly and the real capabilities. Can you fairly compare the military power of the United States and Venezuela?
Look, it's practically impossible to compare them on equal footing. According to the 2025 Global Military Power Ranking, the United States is number 1 in the world, Russia second, China third, and Venezuela way down in 50th place out of 145 countries analyzed. The US has the most powerful military on the planet, with global reach, the ability to fight on multiple continents at the same time, 11 aircraft carriers, strategic bombers, military surveillance satellites, drone technology. Venezuela, even with a large armed force, about 350,000 active troops and over 1.6 million organized civilian militiamen, has nothing remotely close to that.
But even so, Maduro's government keeps insisting it's ready to resist. He even said he'll declare a nation in arms if there's an American attack. Is that just bravado? Or is there some plausible military strategy behind it?
It's not just bravado. They know perfectly well they can't win a direct conventional fight. But they can bet on something that works, making any intervention as difficult as possible. Venezuela's geography is a nightmare for invaders: mountains, Amazon jungle, dense cities, plus a population that, at least partly, would be willing to resist. They play the war of attrition card. They know that in military history, it's not rare for the weaker side to win politically even while losing on the battlefield.
So the idea would be more make the invasion too costly, rather than defeat the enemy? Like making the adversary pay for every single step forward?
Exactly. That's what we call a denial strategy. You don't stop the attack, but you make sure it's not worth it. That can mean urban ambushes, sabotage of critical infrastructure, shaping international public opinion. It's like playing chess when you don't have your queen anymore, but still trying to force a draw or at least make your opponent's win so costly that he gives up halfway through.
And on the American side, even with all that overwhelming firepower, would a direct intervention really be costly?
No question about it. I can speak from experience. Intervening in Venezuela would mean dealing with a mountainous, urbanized terrain, with a politically divided population but prepared for resistance. The Americans would win the initial military phase in days, maybe weeks. But they'd lose the peace for years, maybe decades. That's exactly what haunts Pentagon planners today.
And this recent mobilization of the Venezuelan militia, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Man, the numbers are staggering. Maduro said he mobilized over 1.6 million organized civilian militiamen, on top of the regular armed forces. Of course, training quality varies a lot, but that's still a huge number. It's like every Caracas neighborhood, every town in the countryside, has its own armed civil resistance group. For an invading army, that means there is no safe zone. Any street corner could become an ambush spot.
Chris, you mentioned this war of attrition strategy, and it reminds me of historical conflicts where the technologically superior side still faced enormous difficulties. Do you see parallels between Venezuela's current situation and other asymmetric wars in the past?
Man, military history is full of examples, and the logic of asymmetric resistance is always similar. Take Vietnam, for example. The Americans had all the firepower in the world, but they faced an enemy that knew every inch of the terrain, had significant local support, and used completely unpredictable tactics. That dragged things out for over a decade, with massive political and human costs.
And do you think Maduro is consciously drawing inspiration from that model? Creating a narrative of fighting an imperialist invader, with the people as the first line of defense?
No doubt about it. His rhetoric is practically identical. He constantly talks about national sovereignty, independence, anti-imperialist liberation. That whole discourse builds fertile emotional ground for popular resistance. He knows he can't face the Americans head-to-head, so he bets on morale, on mobilizing the emotional and nationalist base of the country. And it works, at least with a significant part of the Venezuelan population.
But would those tactics really work against an army like the US, which has recent experience with urban combat and counterinsurgency?
They'd work up to a point, and that's what makes it so dangerous. The Americans have learned a lot since Vietnam, and then later in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. They developed counterinsurgency tech, urban warfare tactics, local intelligence networks. But every theater of operations has its own unique traps. The tropical Caribbean, the Amazon jungle, Caracas' slums, all that creates a chaotic operational environment. Even a super well-trained army struggles in terrain like that.
And there's an important difference. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the Americans were fighting far from home. In Venezuela, it would be practically in their own backyard.
Exactly, and that cuts both ways. On the one hand, the Americans would have much shorter supply lines, easier logistical support. On the other hand, anything that goes wrong there would be all over US news the same day, in high-definition footage. The political pressure at home would be massive. And Venezuela is right next to other South American countries that could complicate things diplomatically.
So even without meaningful air or naval power, Venezuela could still cause huge problems?
They could, and that's exactly what makes the whole situation so dangerous. Asymmetric resistance doesn't need supersonic jets or aircraft carriers to work. It needs three things: popular motivation, deep knowledge of the terrain, and tactical adaptability. And that, at least in theory, Venezuela has.
It's interesting how you put it, because it feels like we're watching a kind of military chess game being played out in the Caribbean in real time.
That's exactly it. And what worries me, speaking as someone who's been in similar situations, is that this kind of game can spiral out of control real quick. Just yesterday we heard about that US attack on a Venezuelan vessel, with at least 11 dead. Trump confirmed it publicly. Maduro hit back with more threats. Each move triggers a counter-move, and suddenly you've got an escalation no one really planned.
And this drug trafficking issue that the Americans are using as the official justification for their military presence, do you think it's real? Or just a pretext?
Both, in my view. Drug trafficking is real. The Trump administration even raised the bounty on Maduro's capture to $50 million, accusing him of leading a cartel. But using that as justification to send 8 warships and Marines? That's over the top. In practice, everybody knows this is pure geopolitics. The war on drugs is a convenient narrative, but what's really happening is a power struggle for regional influence among global players.
Chris, the images coming out of Venezuela in the past weeks are really striking. At the end of August 2025, Maduro officially called up 4.5 million militiamen to enlist. And we've been seeing civilians with wooden rifles in training, young people volunteering, groups patrolling neighborhoods. But tell me this, is this mobilization something genuinely spontaneous from the Venezuelan people? Or are we looking at a calculated strategy from Caracas?
Look, it's a fascinating and dangerous mix at the same time. What we're seeing has two very different layers. The Bolivarian militia was created by Hugo Chavez in 2009 and formally integrated into the armed forces in 2010, being presented as the regime's fifth component. So there is an institutional structure behind all of this. But here's the interesting point: when Maduro talks about resisting what he calls American imperialism, that really resonates with a significant part of the Venezuelan population. It's a sentiment that goes back to Simón Bolívar's days, you know? The idea of national sovereignty against foreign powers has deep historical roots in the country.
And that must create a completely different military scenario from anything an American commander would be used to facing, right?
Exactly. When you've got millions of civilians willing to pick up arms to defend their territory, even if those arms are improvised at first, the math of a military operation changes completely. We're no longer just talking about defeating Venezuela's regular forces, which would already be tough given the mountainous terrain and dense cities. Now you've got entire families setting up resistance points, people who know every street, every alley, every shortcut in their communities. Any veteran who's been in Iraq or Afghanistan will tell you, facing a hostile, armed local population is the worst tactical nightmare there is.
But there's a kind of contradiction in this whole thing, right? Because according to recent reports, Enlistment into these militias hasn't exactly been a roaring success. Are people really rushing to sign up? Or is this more about propaganda?
That's a very sharp observation. Reality on the ground is always more complex than official numbers suggest. There are multiple layers here. First, you've got those who genuinely support Maduro's government and see this mobilization as a just cause. Second, there are people who sign up due to social pressure or even economic necessity. Sometimes being in the militias means access to food or basic benefits in a country with serious economic struggles. And third, there are those who simply don't want to get involved, but also can't openly say so. So the numbers may be inflated, but the psychological impact of the mobilization campaign is real, both internally and for outside observers.
And that psychological impact works as a weapon in itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's pure psychological warfare. Even if only a fraction of those 4.5 million people actually take up arms, the message is clear: come try to invade us and see what happens. That serves multiple purposes. First, it boosts the morale of Venezuela's regular forces, who know they'll supposedly have civilian backing. Second, it massively complicates any American military planning, because now they have to consider not only the Venezuelan army but also a potential popular uprising. And third, it creates a powerful narrative for the rest of Latin America, a small South American country gearing up to face the world's strongest military power.
But you mentioned this could turn into a double-edged sword. What are the risks of this strategy?
The risks are huge, and frankly, they could be devastating for the Venezuelan people themselves. First, armed civilians without proper military training can easily become targets, or worse, cause accidental casualties among their own compatriots. Second, from the perspective of international law, the line between combatants and non-combatants gets completely blurred. That can justify, in the eyes of some military commanders, the use of lethal force against civilians who'd normally be protected under international conventions. And third, every civilian with a gun is also a potential point of internal instability. Weapons in the hands of the civilian population can easily turn against the government itself if things start going downhill economically or politically.
Now, Chris, let's widen this geopolitical chessboard. Because obviously this isn't just an issue between Washington and Caracas. China's been playing hardball in Venezuela for years. Recently, Chinese companies signed production-sharing contracts with Venezuela valid for 20 years, with investments of over $1 billion just in oil fields. How do you see this Chinese presence at this moment of rising tension?
China's strategy in Venezuela is a perfect example of what I call smart power. Beijing knows very well it can't compete with Washington militarily in the Western Hemisphere, and it doesn't need to. Instead of sending aircraft carriers or building military bases, the Chinese are building a presence through capital, technology, and economic dependence. Their goal is already to ramp up Venezuelan oil exports to China to 1 million barrels per day, from the current 330,000 barrels. That's not just trade, that's building mutual strategic dependence.
And that kind of influence must make Washington extremely uncomfortable. I imagine.
Uncomfortable is putting it mildly. We're talking about a rival power establishing a significant presence in what Americans traditionally consider their backyard. It's almost like a modern version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but instead of nuclear warheads, we've got pipelines, refineries, and long-term contracts. And here's the most frustrating part for US strategists: you can't just bomb alone or sanction a joint venture the same way you would a military facility. Economic influence is quiet, persistent, and very hard to undo once it's established.
But if a direct clash between the US and Venezuela really happens, would China get militarily involved to protect its investments?
Chinese troops on Venezuelan soil? Highly unlikely, at least at first. The Chinese are way too pragmatic and strategic to jump into a direct military showdown with the Americans in the Caribbean. But that doesn't mean they just sit on their hands. Beijing's been responding to the rising tension with more investments, signaling a shift in the regional power balance. We can expect logistical, technological, and intelligence support, cyber operations, and certainly a massive diplomatic campaign and international forums to isolate the US politically.
So in a way, Venezuela has become a testing ground for this new superpower rivalry?
Perfectly put. Venezuela is exactly that, a laboratory for the 21st century Cold War. But unlike the original Cold War, where the lines were clearer and the confrontation was mainly ideological, now we're seeing a messy mix of economic, energy, tech, and geopolitical interests. China's not trying to export communism to Venezuela, they're trying to secure access to energy resources and build spheres of influence that chip away at American hegemony. It's state capitalism versus market capitalism, and Venezuela has become the main battleground in Latin America.
And that puts the whole region in a tough spot, doesn't it?
Extremely tough. Because now every Latin American country has to pick a side, whether they want to or not. There's no more comfortable neutrality when you've got US warships sailing in the Caribbean at the same time Chinese businessmen are signing billion-dollar contracts just a few miles away. Every regional government is calculating, if I support the Americans, I lose Chinese capital. If I stay too neutral, I might end up isolated from both sides. If I side too much with China, I could become a target for US pressure. It's a balancing act that can't last forever.
And speaking of that, Chris, how are Venezuela's neighbors reacting to all this escalation? Because we've got countries with very different stances in the region. Brazil trying to stay somewhat neutral, Argentina, Paraguay, and Ecuador leaning more clearly toward the US. Cuba obviously siding with Venezuela, and Colombia in a particularly complicated position because of the border.
It's a true mosaic of conflicting interests, and it shows how South America isn't a monolithic bloc like many imagine. Brazil, through Special Advisor Celso Amorim, made it clear it's never accepted external interventions, which is historically consistent with Brazilian diplomacy. Brasilia is trying to play mediator in the region, but experts point out the current diplomatic climate makes that role really tough. It's hard to be a mediator when one side has warships parked in your neighborhood and the other is mobilizing millions of civilians.
And Colombia's position must be especially complex, given they share a long border with Venezuela and have a history of alignment with Washington.
Colombia's in an impossible spot. On one hand, Bogotá has long-standing ties with Washington and depends on U.S. cooperation in the fight against narco-trafficking and armed groups. On the other hand, they share a 200-kilometer border with Venezuela, host millions of Venezuelan refugees, and know that any major instability will directly hit their economy and internal security. Recently, Colombia even revealed that the U.S. promised not to intervene militarily in Venezuela, which suggests they're actively working behind the scenes to dial down tensions.
And smaller countries like Trinidad and Tobago, right there in the middle of all this, must be in an even more vulnerable position, right?
Trinidad and Tobago is a perfect example of how small nations can become collateral damage in this kind of geopolitical confrontation. They're just a few miles from Venezuela's coast, they're an important regional energy hub, and they have no military capacity to defend themselves if things really heat up. In tense scenarios like this, small countries often turn into escape routes for refugees, intelligence gathering points, or even improvised logistical bases. And they simply have no choice, they're geographically forced to deal with the consequences of decisions made by bigger powers.
So even if this is technically a bilateral conflict between the US and Venezuela, the potential for regional spillover is huge.
Massive. Think about it, Venezuela produces oil that feeds refineries across the Caribbean. Any disruption in that production affects regional prices immediately. Venezuela is also a transit route for drugs heading to the US and Europe. Any instability there shifts trafficking routes, hitting neighboring countries. And of course, there's the migration issue. Venezuela's oil output already dropped drastically in recent years, from 2.3 million barrels per day in 2015 to just 851,000 in 2024, and that already created millions of refugees. An armed conflict would multiply that number exponentially.
Do you see any chance of a coordinated regional initiative to try to mediate this crisis before it spirals out of control?
There are attempts behind the scenes, for sure. Recently, Brazilian Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira spoke with Venezuelan authorities about the regional tension, and we know there are discussions in forums like CELAC and even at the UN. But the problem is that many Latin American governments are politically fragile at home and economically dependent on both the US and China in different ways. Nobody wants to anger Washington and lose access to the American market, but nobody wants to irritate Beijing and lose Chinese investments either. So you get lots of diplomatic talk, lots of statements calling for dialogue and peace, but very little coordinated action.
So that suggests the region doesn't currently have the institutional capacity to handle a crisis of this magnitude?
Unfortunately, that's a realistic assessment. Experts consider a direct invasion unlikely at this point, but regional institutions, UNASUR, CELAC, Mercosur, were built to handle trade disputes and traditional diplomatic issues, not geopolitical confrontations involving global superpowers. When you've got US fleets strategically positioned in the Caribbean and Chinese companies signing decades-long contracts in Venezuela, that's way beyond what these organizations can manage. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a bucket of water. The tools just aren't up to the job.
And that must leave civilians all across the region facing a lot of uncertainty about what could come next.
Exactly. And that uncertainty itself is already a form of instability. Ordinary people in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, they're seeing US warships off their coasts, hearing about millions of Venezuelans arming themselves, and wondering, is this going to hit my family? My job? My safety? That kind of psychological tension has real economic effects. Investments get delayed, tourism drops, financial markets turn volatile. So even without shots being fired, the region is already paying the price of this rising tension. It's a lose-lose situation, except maybe for arms manufacturers and speculators who profit from instability.
Chris, so far we've talked about calculated strategies and shows of force. But there's always that factor no one can fully control: human error, accidents, those moments no one saw coming. With 8 US warships sailing close to Venezuela, carrying over 1,000 missiles, how real is the risk of an unplanned escalation?
Look, that risk is extremely high, and I say that based on my first-hand experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let me tell you a real story. One time, a single warning shot at a suspicious vehicle ended up triggering 4 hours of heavy fighting, simply because the information got misinterpreted by command. Now imagine that in the Caribbean, where we've got over 4,000 US Marines and sailors operating in international waters, helicopters constantly overhead, and submarines below. It's like two nervous guys in a packed bar, shoulder to shoulder, one accidental bump and the punches start flying. The difference here is that we're talking about state-of-the-art weapons of war.
And world history gives us clear examples of this, doesn't it? The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which basically dragged the US into the Vietnam War, or the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came within minutes of a nuclear disaster. Do you see direct parallels with what's happening now?
I see very clear parallels, and they worry me a lot. The Gulf of Tonkin started exactly with a murky naval incident. In fact, historians still argue about whether it really happened the way it was reported, and that became the perfect excuse to dive headfirst into Vietnam. In Cuba, it was one mispositioned missile that almost brought global-scale destruction. What these historical episodes teach us is that when you've got high-tension scenarios like the current one, the margins for error become microscopic. Just yesterday we had Trump confirming a US military strike on a Venezuelan vessel in international waters. He literally said, "We eliminated it." That shows how any misunderstanding can spiral fast.
So you're saying it's not just deliberate political decisions that could trigger conflict, but pure chance as well?
Exactly, and that's what worries me most. Because political decisions, however tense, still go through debates, negotiations, diplomatic channels. But chance is completely unpredictable and uncontrollable. Let me give you concrete examples. Imagine a US reconnaissance plane that, due to a simple navigation system glitch, strays a few kilometers into Venezuelan airspace. For the American pilots, it's just a technical error. But from Caracas's perspective, it looks like a deliberate territorial invasion. Or picture a local fishing boat mistaken for a cartel speedboat during a nighttime operation. These aren't hypothetical scenarios, they've happened dozens of times around the world. And once the initial spark goes off, putting out the fire is infinitely harder than preventing it in the first place.
Now, Chris, let's look at the other side of this coin. Despite all this military tension we're seeing, both the United States and Venezuela don't actually seem to want an open-armed conflict. Is there still genuine space for diplomacy in this scenario?
There always is, and I honestly believe that space is much bigger than it looks on the surface. The United States knows perfectly well that an armed conflict in Venezuela would come with an absolutely devastating human, political, and economic cost. We're talking about a country of 28 million people, with complex geography and a population that, regardless of what they think about Maduro, is not going to just passively accept a foreign invasion. On the Venezuelan side, Maduro knows there's no way he can win a direct fight against the world's top military power. So even with all this media noise and these shows of force, there's a quiet but powerful logic operating behind the scenes. Both sides want to avoid direct confrontation.
But how does that work in practice? How does this invisible diplomacy happen while we're watching warships at sea?
That's where the political back channels come in, and they're way more sophisticated than the public usually imagines. There are quiet talks happening in regional forums, careful approaches through countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, and even indirect messages sent through speeches at international bodies. Venezuela recently moved closer to China, for example, and that's not just about economics, it's also a clear diplomatic message to Washington. It means, look, we've got other powerful partners. At the same time, the Americans are stressing that this operation is against drug trafficking, not directly against the Venezuelan government.
Chris, what you're describing makes me think there's almost a double game going on, where what we see publicly is one thing, but what's happening behind the diplomatic curtain is totally different. But I've got to ask, doesn't all this tough talk we keep hearing, Trump talking about sinking boats, Maduro mobilizing millions of militiamen, end up hurting the very diplomatic space you're talking about?
Look, that's one of the smartest questions you can ask about international diplomacy, because it goes straight to the heart of how foreign policy really works in the real world. And the answer may surprise you, that tough rhetoric not only doesn't hurt diplomacy, it's actually an integral part of the process itself. Let me explain this seemingly contradictory dynamic. The fiery rhetoric actually serves as a kind of necessary political theater that allows both sides to keep their domestic credibility while, at the same time, creating room for diplomatic maneuvering behind the scenes. On the American side, Trump has to show strength and determination to several different audiences. First, to the American electorate, especially after promising during his campaign a hard line against the drug cartels that directly affect U.S. cities. Second, to other countries in the region watching how the U.S. handles challenges to its regional influence. And third, to the American political system itself, including Congress and the national security establishment. If Trump looked weak or hesitant in public, that would weaken his bargaining position in private. It's like a diplomatic poker game, you can't show your cards or display doubt, because that instantly cuts your leverage. On the Venezuelan side, Maduro is under even more intense pressure. He needs to rally domestic support by showing he's ready to resist what he calls imperialist aggression. When he announces the mobilization of 4.5 million militiamen, he's not just making military preparations, he's sending a message to his own people that the government is ready to defend national sovereignty at all costs. But here's the crucial detail most people miss: while those fiery public statements are being made for the cameras, diplomats and military officials on both sides are keeping communication channels open and functional.
So you're saying it's almost like there are two parallel conversations happening at the same time, one public and theatrical, the other private and pragmatic?
Exactly. You nailed the essence of what I'm trying to explain. It's like two movies being filmed at the same time in the same place, but with totally different scripts. In the public movie, we've got shows of force, nationalist speeches, tough declarations about sovereignty and national security. That movie is made for domestic audiences and the wider international community. In the private movie, which we never see directly, the conversations are way more pragmatic and calculated. These are discussions about very specific scenarios. If we reduce naval presence by X%, what would Venezuela's response be in terms of anti-drug cooperation? Or if Venezuela offered controlled access to its territorial waters for anti-narcotics operations, would that change the dynamic? I've seen this double dynamic work many times during my military career, especially in the Middle East. I remember situations where, in the morning, American and Iraqi generals were making very harsh public statements against each other. But in the afternoon, representatives from those same commands were sitting at the same table, drinking tea, and working out patrol routes to avoid unnecessary incidents. The secret is understanding that these two layers of communication don't just coexist, they complement each other. The public rhetoric creates the pressure and urgency needed for the private talks to be taken seriously by everyone involved, even mobilizing 4.5 million militiamen as a show they won't bow to outside pressure. But while the cameras are rolling on these fiery speeches, diplomats and military officials on both sides are actively seeking dialogue channels. I've seen this happen many times in my career. The public discourse is fire and steel, but behind closed doors, there's coffee, civil conversation, and a search for practical solutions.
And do you see any real chance of a negotiated solution that would be at least somewhat favorable for both sides?
I do, and there are several concrete possibilities being explored, though obviously not publicly. One would be the United States gradually reducing its naval presence in exchange for real, verifiable Venezuelan cooperation against the cartels. Another possibility would be partial, progressive relief of U.S. economic sanctions in exchange for internal commitments from Venezuela, like internationally supervised elections or human rights guarantees. It's not going to be a perfect deal, diplomatic deals never are. But if both governments can save face with their respective public images, that already counts as a political win for both sides. At the end of the day, successful diplomacy is exactly that. Everybody leaves the table complaining a little, but the conflict doesn't blow up. Hopeful scenarios and regional strengthening.
Chris, after everything we've analyzed, all this tension, these risks, these shows of force, let's try to end on a more optimistic note. Is there any realistic scenario where Venezuela could actually come out stronger from this crisis, instead of weakened or destroyed?
There is, and this is where a concept I've learned over the years comes in: political resilience can be more powerful than military strength. If Maduro or whoever comes after him in Venezuela's government manages to withstand the pressure without completely caving, avoid an all-out armed conflict, and negotiate with smart strategy, he could turn this whole episode into a powerful symbol of national resistance. Venezuela could emerge as an example of a country that faced the world's greatest military power and not only survived, but kept its sovereignty. That generates massive political capital, especially here in Latin America, where there's a long-standing and well-founded mistrust of U.S. interventions in the region.
And thinking about Latin America as a whole, is there any positive impact that could come out of this crisis?
I think so, and it could be something transformative in the long run. This whole crisis could serve as a catalyst for something that's been discussed in the region for decades: greater autonomy and political integration among Latin American countries. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, they're all seeing firsthand that when geopolitical giants like the US and China fight, it's the smaller neighbors who really suffer the consequences. Venezuela itself already showed this by mobilizing 15,000 troops to its border with Colombia to control drug trafficking. So maybe all this pressure pushes the region to build stronger, more independent mechanisms for defense, diplomacy, and economic integration, without relying so much on Washington or Beijing. It would be a harsh, costly lesson, but with important benefits for the coming decades.
Interesting perspective. You're suggesting that a crisis can create opportunities for regional political maturity?
Exactly. International crises, as dangerous as they are, sometimes force countries to grow politically very quickly. The European Union, for example, strengthened significantly after every major crisis it faced. Here in Latin America, this situation is showing every government that we need our own conflict resolution mechanisms, economic integration that doesn't depend solely on US or Chinese markets, and coordinated regional security policies. Brazil is already mediating informal talks, Mexico is offering diplomatic channels, Colombia is sharing cartel intelligence. All this could evolve into more permanent, effective structures of regional cooperation.
So, Chris, despite all the risks we've discussed, it's not a completely hopeless scenario. There's still real space for hope?
Absolutely. The geopolitical chessboard is tense, very tense, but it's definitely not checkmate yet. History teaches us that even in huge crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis we mentioned, or the Suez Crisis in 1956, diplomacy managed to avoid the worst-case scenario. Hope not only exists but needs to be actively cultivated, every day, with real political responsibility from all sides involved. Maduro announced the deployment of 15,000 soldiers to reinforce security at the Colombian border, but that can also be read as a defensive move, not an offensive one. And in the end, we always have to remember it's ordinary people, Venezuelans, Colombians, Brazilians, Americans who pay the highest price for instability. It's with those people, those families, in mind that all of us, politicians, military, journalists, have to hope reason, diplomacy, and common sense win out over fiery rhetoric and shows of force.
Perfect. Chris, an important reflection to close on. Thanks for the detailed analysis. And let's hope diplomacy really does prevail over military tensions.
Thanks for the opportunity. Let's hope that when we look back a few years from now, this crisis will have been just another tense chapter that was resolved through dialogue.